Again, welcome back to the Wisdom of the Zohar. We're going to continue. We left off in the middle of a discussion about the mystical reason behind the lighting of Shabbos candles, why women in particular. After all, the requirement of lighting Shabbos candles are not just for a woman, they're also for a man. If a man is alone in his house, and there's no wife, sister, mother, daughter, the man lights the Shabbos candles, because the mitzvah is that the home should be illuminated. But nevertheless, when there is a woman, it's the woman's prerogative, it's her privilege, it's her responsibility. And the question is why? And the Zohar referred to the Talmudic reason and accepted it, but then gave a mystical reason. The Talmudic reason was Eve, the first woman, fed her husband the forbidden fruit, which resulted in introducing death to the world. Death is the extinguishing of a flame. The soul is likened to a flame. And therefore, since Eve was the one who extinguished that flame, Eve's gender, women from all ages, have to rekindle it by lighting the Shabbos candles. It's not really a negative reason. It's merely saying that the women were given that special responsibility because it just so happened that the first woman actually contributed to the extinguishing of the light, so God gave her that challenge. We all have challenges, and the challenges that each of us has as individuals relate specifically to their weaknesses, which, if you look at it from another vantage point, a weakness is not really a weakness or deficiency. It means that God says, this is what challenge I want you to shoulder. But then the Zohar itself says that's fine, but there's a secret reason. And the secret reason is that the divine source of all souls, where all souls coalesce into one body, in Kabbalistic terminology, it's called the divine attribute of Malchus, of royalty, the queen. It's a feminine attribute. That's where all souls originate. And every soul is likened to a candle or flame. When I say candle, actually there's no requirement of lighting candles for Shabbos. Many people use oil lamps, just like we do in Hanukkah. Some people use oil instead of candles. I just use the word candle because that seems to be the most convenient word to use. But it's a light, a flame. That all souls are likened to flames. It says in the book of Proverbs, the flame or the candle of God is the soul of man. We are all in possession of godly flames. And all those flames come together in that divine attribute of royalty, of Malchus. And since a woman is the queen of the house, so in this physical world, who represents royalty? It's the mother, the wife, the woman in the home. She is called the queen of the home. Therefore, it's fitting that she should be the one to light the Shabbos candles, because lighting of the Shabbos candles introduces that divine light from the source of souls. That's the mystical reason why women in particular light the Shabbos candles. The Rebbe, in one of his talks, in a footnote actually, points out that the simple reason, the Talmudic reason, and the mystical reason have changed in terms of their relevance. Number one, the mystical reason is called a secret. Secret means it's not for publication, not for publicizing. But that was then, when Kabbalah was supposed to be an esoteric, secret discipline allowed to be studied only by the select few elite. Even amongst the greatest of the Talmudic rabbis, up until the last 400 or 500 years, the majority of them did not study Kabbalah. Only the elite. Maimonides, who was clearly the greatest rabbi of his time and maybe of centuries before and after, there's a big controversy amongst Kabbalists and historians if he did study Kabbalah. There's no trace of it in his works. Some say he did study Kabbalah and that he did it at the end of his life, and maybe he did hint to it somehow. But the fact that even the greatest rabbi, Maimonides, was not necessarily steeped in the teachings of Kabbalah points to that very elite, select group that were privy to these teachings. That's the meaning of the word secret. Literally, it was a secret. It was whispered to a few people. The Rebbe says that has changed. There's certain things that are not supposed to change, but there are certain things that are required to change. The light of Kabbalah was something that the world couldn't take then. The world had to go through more transformation, more development, more refinement. But as we get closer to the Messianic age, the Arizal, the great Kabbalist of the 16th century, in fact considered to be the greatest Kabbalist, on par with Rab Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi, the author of the Zohar, he says now it's a mitzvah. It's a religious requirement to publicize this knowledge. And as the generations progressed, it became more and more pronounced to the point where today, although not always in the right way, Kabbalah has become a popular subject. So the Rebbe says, therefore, the balance between the Talmudic and the mystical has changed in favor of the mystical, because now it's no longer a secret. And then the Rebbe says something else quite startling, and he says that the reason, the Talmudic reason, that it's to correct Eve's mistake is no longer relevant because we've already corrected it. With the passage of time, of thousands of years, we are no longer in need of correcting Eve's mistake. Now it's just the mystical reason that is relevant. We are here, women are here to bring more light into the world because they are connected to the source of souls, the source of light. And that's their special privilege and their special challenge. Not as a way of correcting something, but a way of increasing something that they have the power, and only they have the power to do. The Zohar says that they have to do it with joy, with goodwill, heartfelt joy with goodwill. The simple reason for that, I think I mentioned last week, just repeat it briefly, is that Shabbos is all about joy. The mitzvah, one of the primary obligations of Shabbos is to have oneg Shabbat. Oneg means delight, rejoicing with the Shabbos. It's a day of great joy. So it's obvious that when you usher in the Shabbos by lighting the candles, it has to be done in the spirit of what the Shabbos is all about. In another discourse, the Rebbe explains that there are three expressions over here. There's the lighting with joy and with will. These correspond to three parts of the flame. In a flame, there are many, many colors and many shades, but basically when you look at a normal flame, there's two. There's the darker color and there's the lighter color. Then there's the hidden color. And actually, there are those scientists who believe that there is a dark flame that you cannot see. But to get to that heat, which is infinite heat, there would be nothing left. So that's why it's theoretical, there's that dark flame. Well, Kabbalah says the same thing in mystical terms, in spiritual terms. That when you deal with a flame, with spiritual fire, there's the dark flame. It's called the black flame. Doesn't necessarily mean black, but the dark flame. Then there's the lighter flame. Then there's the hidden flame. Those are the three different aspects. And they correspond to three different levels of divine expression. which are mirrored in our souls. The divine expression of the level of Malchus, royalty again, that relates primarily to action. That's the focus on action. Then there's the divine attributes, the emotional attributes. That corresponds to with a full, what is the expression? Heartfelt joy. And then there's the transcendent aspect, which is divine will, corresponding that we do it with good will. In other words, the divine manifests itself in three ways. There's the overt way it manifests itself, with God's expressing his emotions. Where do we see God's emotions? It's evident all over. You look at a storm, that's God expressing rage, the devastating storm. You see a beautiful sunrise, that's God expressing his benevolence, his kindness, his desire to give life. So when you look at the world, you see God's emotions. When you look at the world, you see God's actions. Obviously, he created the world, but you see not only his actions, but his emotions. But when it comes to his reasons for everything, why he is doing what he's doing, why he's expressing himself in one way or another, that's elusive, that's hidden. That's the divine will. We don't know the divine, we can't capture the divine will, the divine rationale and will for everything. That's the elusive part. So in the fire itself, there's the part that's closer to the flame. That's the down-to-earth aspect of God's presence in this world, where God does things, we see his actions. Then there's the lighter flame, that's further away, that's where God expresses his emotions. But then there's the hidden flame, where God has his will and his reasons, his rationale for everything that is elusive, that is beyond us. And the Zohar therefore says that we light the Shabbos candles, we are able to generate all those three aspects of God's presence in this world. Even the hidden is represented here. Now, how do we respond to that? By using three parts of our personality. There's one part of our personality which is our actions. That corresponds to the darker part of the flame. We just act. We light the candles. So even if you're not in the mood of lighting candles, you still light the candles because at least you can get that lower flame. But then you should do it with, not just with action, but do it with heartfelt joy. Express your emotions. When you light the candles, there should be your emotions, and that is true with many women, and it's the ideal way of lighting Shabbos candles. Women, they close their eyes. There are several reasons for it, but one of the reasons is they can be in touch with their own feelings and emotions. That's when they say the most heartfelt prayers. That's the most poignant time of the week for any woman, when she lights her Shabbos candles. That's when she blocks everything else out of her life. All she has is her request to God, her speech, her communication with God, heart to heart, so to speak. That's the joy of the lighting of the Shabbos candles. But then there's the elusive aspect of it, coming from God's will. So how do you respond to that? By doing it with your will, showing your total desire to do what God wants you to do and bringing light into the world. And the Rebbe then says that what are the blessings the Zohar promises for us, for the woman who lights the Shabbos candles? It will give her children who will illuminate the world with Torah and reverence for God, increase the peace in the world, and grant her husband long life. So, if you really think about it, all of these different benefits encompass the totality of what are our needs. The Zohar says, what are human needs? All human needs can be contained in three words: children, life, and sustenance. Life means health. Sustenance, when you light Shabbos candles, it says it brings peace in the home. One of the greatest impediments to peace, domestic peace, is a lack of sustenance. When there's no money in the home, when there's Strife, well, one of the reasons for lighting Shabbos candles is to remove that strife and to ensure peace, which goes along with sustenance. It gives life to the husband, that's life, and it also blesses you with children who will go in the right path of Torah and reverence for God. Okay, now we go to text 2. This is actually from an earlier section. Reb Shimon, the author of the Zohar, arose and he said, I reflected on this matter. When God desired to create Adam, all of the upper and lower worlds trembled. When God created the rest of the world, no one trembled. But when he created Adam, the entire cosmos, upper and lower. What does upper and lower mean? There are spiritual upper worlds, and lower means the physical world. But even within the spiritual itself, there are upper realms and lower realms. The upper realms are much more in touch with God's presence than the lower realms, but they're also spiritual. So when God said, let us create man, everyone trembled. Why? Why are we so, controversial? So, this is the way the Rebbe's father, who was a great Kabbalist, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak Schneerson was his name, who was exiled because of his counter-revolutionary activities in the Soviet Union. He promoted Judaism openly and was threatened, and he was imprisoned and then sent into exile where he passed away prematurely. So in his exile, he was not allowed any amenities, of course. All he had was 2 books, actually one, the Zohar, which is 3 volumes, and another book, the Tanya, a primary Hasidic classic. And his wife, the Rebbe's mother, created ink out of herbs, and he wrote on the margin of his books. And from those marginal notes, the Rebbe published 3 volumes. One volume is about 500 pages. And incredible brilliance. And the man had a photographic memory because he quotes, he's in exile, he had no other books, and I don't even think he had Google. This is the 1940s. But without Google, and without Wikipedia, and so on, he quotes passages in the Talmud, Midrash, Kabbalah, other works, not just quoting what they said, but the exact chapter and verse. Hundreds of sources, maybe thousands. And in one place he goes on for about 20 pages on the margin, just explaining one passage in the Zohar. And this is only a tiny bit of what he wrote. Most of his writings were lost, unfortunately, that he wrote when he was still free. But anyhow, in his commentary to the Zohar, he explains the following, but I'm going to just embellish it a little by giving you an introduction. In the Torah, when God creates man, what does it say? Let us make man. And this has troubled all Bible commentators. Who is the us? When God creates the animals, he doesn't say us, only when he creates man. So first of all, who is the us? There's only one God, and the Torah uses the singular even in that verse. So it's one God, yet he says us. And obviously some other religions seize on that, and they say, you see, there's proof of the existence of multiple Godheads, which of course is nonsense, because the Torah says clearly there's only one God, and there is nothing else but God. So this begs for an explanation. Rashi, who gives us the simple explanation, says this is a manner of speech to show humility. That when you want to do a major project, you consult with others. Even if you think you're the smartest person in the world, you always consult with others. Now, God is the smartest, but still he consulted with his angels. And Rashi quotes sources where it says clearly that God consults with angels. And this is to teach us humility, that whenever you come to doing a major project, always show humility by consulting with others. So that's Rashi's simple explanation, that he's consulting with the angels. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, gave a very down-to-earth spiritual explanation. that the us means us, God and us. Because animal is God made the animal. We don't make animals. God makes us, but we're not complete without ourselves. Yes?
Could I just, so Adam or Adamah is clay or earth, so it would make sense that you would say that in the future, because he's speaking with the soul, so that
we're a composite of body and soul. Yes, that's not the Baal Shem Tov, that's a separate interpretation. We'll get to it in a moment. So the Baal Shem Tov says very simply, we are products of our making. The Hebrew word for let us make, nasa, the word nasa has the implication of completion, perfection. God creates an imperfect being. Who makes the human being perfect? Us. We're supposed to do that. We're supposed to perfect ourselves. So who in the end is making man? Us. God and us. Now, there's the Zohar that gives, this Zohar that we're just studying right now, and other sources as well, says the us means the whole cosmos. Now, you just refer to another interpretation that us means that we are a composite of body and soul. That the soul comes from God and the body comes from the earth. So it's us, it's God and the earth. But the Zohar says something much more radical than that. That God, when he says, let us, he's referring to the entire universe. To every aspect of creation is involved in the creation of man. We are not just a distinct part of creation, which we are, but we're not just a distinct part of creation. We are also a composite of every aspect in creation. So if there are forests in creation, there are forests in the human being. If there are stars, then we have stars. If there are atoms, then we have atoms. Whatever it is in creation, animals, plants, everything exists within the human being. We are a micro world that contains everything in the macro world. And that's what the Rebbe's father in his work called Likutei Levi Yitzchak, which means the anthology of Levi Yitzchak, which was his name, he says that man, the human being, therefore, has a powerful effect on the whole universe. Not only do we believe in a universe where what we do here affects someplace else. I mean, if I push the first domino, then all the dominoes fall. But it doesn't mean that I'm really connected to the last domino. It just means there's a domino effect. The Zohar goes beyond that. Because I think modern science believes that everything we do impacts every part of the universe, but how so? Indirectly. But the Zohar says, no, it's not indirect, it's direct. The whole universe is in me, is in you, and in every one of us. So everything we do impacts every single part, every atom of the universe, every creation, the smallest to the largest, is affected by man. Therefore, the Rebbe's father says, if we do something wrong, if we miss the mark, we undermine the whole creation. That's why the Zohar says the whole universe trembled when God said, let us make man. Because the whole world is going to be affected. Before man was created, the world, machaya, it breathed freely. It didn't have to worry about anything. If one creature didn't behave, it didn't make such a big difference to another creature. But now you're creating something that has such a powerful effect. Only the Zohar could say a thing like this. This is a very, very radical statement. The Rebbe, in his commentary on his father's commentary to the Zohar, takes it a step further. He said, no, it's not the sins that the world was worried about. The Rebbe doesn't like to dwell on sins. That's a common theme in the Rebbe's teachings. He doesn't even use the word, negative words. The Rebbe would try to avoid using any negative word, always use a euphemism. Even when he spoke about death, he would say the absence of life, and so on and so forth. The Rebbe never liked the fact that in Israel, a hospital is called a house of the sick, a sick house. Same as in German. The Rebbe says it should be called a house of healing. Don't focus on the negative, focus on the positive. So the Rebbe says the world was not trembling because he says, oh, man is so horrible, he's going to sin, he's going to degrade us, he's going to harm us. But that man has the ability to affect a change in the world, to transform the whole world. And the world was so in awe, it was like embarrassed. Not it trembled because it was afraid it would be destroyed. When you're in the presence of someone so great and so wonderful and so special, you look at yourself and say, look, I'm a nobody. It's a certain sense of awe. And that's why it trembled. It's the awe that the world experienced with the creation of man. Because man is so majestic, is so great, that he could bring the world to its fulfillment that no other creature can do.
Sorry, I just wanted, a long time ago I heard Me'od Tov.
Tov Me'od.
Tov Me'od. Man is very good, and this very is the extra, which is the capacity for good and evil, which is tied to
Right, because when did God use the term, and everything God saw was Tov Me'od, very good, that was after the creation of Adam. Every day God says he saw that it was good. What does that mean? He saw that it was good. Obviously it's good. It means that it has a function. It can fulfill something. Everything in the universe has a purpose. But when he created us, the purpose is beyond anything the universe could experience. So the universe was in total awe of the immense power that human beings have. And that's why it was embarrassed. I'd like to connect this to another place where it says that the world trembled. The Rebbe doesn't mention this, but there might be a connection. In the Talmud it says that when God uttered the 10 Commandments, there was one commandment that the whole world trembled. Which one was that? Don't say my name in vain, which refers specifically to giving an oath where you give a false oath, invoking God's name. That's the definition of an oath, where you swear by God that what you're saying is true, which they still do in courts. When they administer an oath, they use the words, I don't know if they do it in all places, but they would mention God's name, which means that your oath is much more than just promising to tell the truth, but you're more or less saying that God is your witness. It's God who's backing what you're saying, it's not your credibility, it's God's credibility. And when God uttered that commandment, the Talmud says the whole universe trembled. Same expression the Zohar uses here. So it occurred to me that there might be a correlation between the two. The earth didn't tremble when God said, don't commit murder. That's a greater crime than swearing falsely. The world didn't tremble, because the world knows that there are evil people, and the world has everything in it. Why did it tremble specifically about the false oath, invoking God's name? Because what makes the human being and the world, what makes the world complete, is the human being accepting the oath that God gave us at Mount Sinai. God administered an oath. The Talmud always refers to Mount Sinai as an oath. That's where we got our challenge. That's where the world saw the preeminence of the human being. That the human being has a challenge to transform the universe. Up until Sinai, Adam and his descendants had the potential to transform the universe, but not the actual power. That power is introduced at Mount Sinai when God gave us this oath. Before we're born, another place in the Talmud it says, we are given an oath. Our soul is given an oath. The soul doesn't have a right hand to lift up and say, I swear, solemnly swear. It doesn't. What does that mean? The oath in Hebrew, the word for oath is related to another word in Hebrew which means satiation, to fill a person with tremendous energy. We are empowered. Before we're born, the soul is empowered to change the universe. That power that God created man with, he gives each individual, he reintroduces that power by way of an oath, so to speak, before we're born. That's the oath that was given at Mount Sinai. And therefore, when a person betrays that oath, that harks back to the time when the world trembled, when it received the knowledge that God is going to create a human being who will transform the world. Because by breaking that oath, we are causing the world to go downhill and reversing its very purpose and its relationship with us. Anyhow, the Rebbe concludes his commentary on this matter that the human being has two distinct roles. There's the role of the human being who transcends nature. So what's our relationship with the world? It's like a teacher who is sent into a classroom. The teacher is the authority figure over the student. What's the teacher's job? The challenge is to instruct, to get through to the kids. That's our role, as we're the teachers of the world. The world is not us. We're above the world. We have the responsibility to influence the world. So what happens if we don't do our job? It's a failure in us. Because the students supposedly could go to another teacher. But the second role of the human being is that we're an integral part of the universe. We comprise the entire universe in us. If we comprise the entire universe in us, then it's not just we're not doing our job. They'll fire us because we didn't show up to class. We're tardy or didn't teach the material. That's bad enough. That shows that we're not taking our responsibility seriously. But this is much more than that. We're actually affecting the whole world. Let's talk about it in the positive sense. When we show up to the classroom and we give our class, we're not only fulfilling our purpose and we're validating our own existence, but we're also validating the whole universe. The whole universe is made complete through us showing up. Because we're not just teachers and guides and superiors, we are part of the whole universe, of the whole cosmos. The end of the Zohar, it says, Adam was created from the Beis Hamikdash, the holy temple. We know that Adam was created from the earth. Where did he get the earth from? So the Zohar says that God took the earth from the site of the temple, of the Beis Hamikdash, of the holy temple. Mount Moriah, right now where the Temple Mount is, that was the earth that God used to form Adam. The Zohar doesn't say which part of the temple specifically. There are other sources that identify it as the altar, which brings atonement. And the Midrash says that God says, I will create man from the place that brings atonement, so that man has a built-in way of correcting, self-correction. That's an incredible power that human beings have, that we could correct the mistakes that we made, that even if we mess up the whole universe, it's not the end. We can still reverse everything. That's the power that we have. That's another power. But what is the connection, specifically in this context, to the Holy Temple and Adam's creation? One idea the Rebbe says is that generally most theologies focus on the spiritual. And you would think that Kabbalah would certainly be in that category of focusing on the spiritual, which it does a lot. But the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, says no, it's not the spiritual, it's the physical that counts. Building that temple, what is it made out of? It's made out of stone. It's made out of inanimate objects. The tabernacle was made out of vegetation, out of boards and cloth. It comes from animals' hides and linen and so on, from things that grow from the ground. But the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, couldn't have any wood in it. Any wood that it had to be covered up. It was primarily inanimate objects. That underscores that where does our spirituality come from? It comes from the physical human being. Doing physical actions has the power to change the whole world. I would like just to add to that just like the human being comprises the whole universe, so does the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple. What happened there was not just what happens in one synagogue. Like today you have many synagogues. Each synagogue generates a certain amount of spiritual energy for that locale. The Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple, generated energy for the whole world. It comprised the whole world. The whole universe was contained within that structure. So when a human being came to the Holy Temple, that's what gave the human being the power to experience his universal identity, that he comprises the whole universe. Okay, now we go to the next text, part 3. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to interrupt me.
Doesn't the Torah say that Adam came from earth from all over the world?
It doesn't say that in the Torah. There's a medrash that says that he came from all over the world. And another medrash says he was created just from the place of the temple. Now, based on what I just said before, there's no contradiction, because the temple represents that the whole world is contained within those few pieces of earth. So actually, what you said now actually reinforces that idea that the temple was not just one locale, it contained everything. The totality of the universe is concentrated in that one place. Okay, now we're going to go to Noah and Abraham. Noah, the Torah, one of the few people the Torah describes as a righteous person. Noah was a righteous man. Text number 2. He was perfectly righteous in his generation. So the emphasis on his generation is a subject of discussion in the Talmud and in the Zohar. And they both say the same thing, except the Zohar adds the mystical dimension to it. So what does it mean by emphasizing that he was righteous, perfectly righteous, in his generation? Well, obviously he lived in his generation. He didn't live in the 20th century. So the emphasis is that in other generations, he would have been regarded as nothing. In other words, if he would have been in a different generation, no one would have even heard about Noah. He would have not rated as being anything special. Which generations? Such as the generation of Abraham, the generation of Moses, and the generation of David. That's one opinion. The other opinion says the opposite. Obviously. Another explanation. See the deeds he performed in there's an extra word in an all wicked generation. Look how he was so righteous in such a terrible, terrible environment. How much more so if he would have been in a righteous generation, that he would have been even more righteous. So interesting how you could view the same person and you could view it two opposite ways. You could say that he's a nobody. In his generation, he was a shining example because he was the only one who wasn't a corrupt individual. Of course, the question is, why look at him in a negative way? Why look at him in a disparaging way when you can look at him in a positive way? So it's obvious, there are many explanations and many different levels, but we're going to try to focus on just one. It's obvious that even if we talk about someone in a negative way, the Torah does that in many cases, where it talks about different sins that different people committed. The reason is that we're being told that is that we should avoid those things. The Torah doesn't want us to engage in that type of behavior. But here the question is, why does the Zohar pick on these three generations of Abraham, Moses, and David? So the Rebbe's father explains that the word Adam is an acronym. Abraham, the A stands for Abraham, the D stands for David, and the M stands for Moses. That Adam, the prototype of humanity, was the person whose role it was to produce a world that human beings would perfect. Adam didn't achieve what he had set out to achieve. He sinned, and he brought the world down. And these three, Abraham, David, and Moses, were charged with the responsibility of rectifying, of reversing the problems that were caused by Adam. And Noah did not live up to that. Noah was the second Adam, you could say, because he was the father of all humanity. After the flood, the only human beings around were Noah and his children. So Noah is the new Adam. So what was Noah's job? To correct what Adam failed to do. Adam was an experiment. The experiment didn't work, so God says, okay, we're trying all over again. How could God's experiment not work? God gives free choice to people. So now Noah is the new actor on the scene, and he doesn't succeed either. He failed to change the world before the flood. And after the flood, his legacy didn't really catch on. He was a righteous man, but did the world change? No. Look what happened a little bit later. There's the Tower of Babel, and then Sodom, and then Egypt was a very depraved place. So the world essentially didn't change. So that's what the Zohar means in the negative characterization of Noah, that Noah was the second Adam, but he did not really correct and reverse what Adam couldn't do. And who did correct it? The three generations of Moses, David, Abraham, Moses, and David in chronological order. But the Rebbe's father refers to the statement in Ethics of the Fathers that there were three crowns: crown of priesthood, the crown of Torah, the crown of royalty. And then it says the crown of a good name rises above them, which implies that it's lower, but it could rise above. So he says that refers to Noah. Noah was the fourth crown, which is lower, but it rises above. So it has both. It's lower, so that explains the opinion that says he was lower, but it rises above. That explains the opinion that says he was higher. But anyhow, that's an aside. So why these three generations? What did Abraham, David, and Moses have in common? Abraham laid the groundwork. He built the foundation for the rectification of Adam. He was the first person to really change humanity. Noah, great man, but he didn't change humanity. He didn't rectify Adam. Abraham was the first person. Abraham goes around teaching monotheism to the world. There's a mistake that is very common amongst many people who think that Judaism credits Abraham with discovering the belief in one God. Abraham did not discover the belief in one God. He was not the first monotheist. Adam was the first monotheist. Eve was the second monotheist. The third and the fourth were his children. It's later on that monotheism degenerated into polytheism, where they started to look at the various forces of nature, the stars, the sun, the moon, and glorify them to the point where they began to deify them. And then they forgot about God entirely. Abraham merely restored the belief in monotheism that came about in the beginning of the creation. The general idea many people have is that everything starts off simple, primitive, and evolves into something complex. Judaism says that's not necessarily true. Sometimes people start off with something intricate, complex, advanced, and as we go on, it becomes simplified and actually made into something that it was never intended to be, on a much lower level. We are less sophisticated. Most people think 21st century we're much more sophisticated than the great people of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Just take any scientist today who's a brilliant Nobel laureate and put him in the environment of people 2,000 years ago, and he probably couldn't survive a few days without having all the modern amenities. The fact that people were able to survive and thrive and discover things in the planets, they had knowledge of they were able to predict eclipses and everything like that, without all the tools that we have today, they were much more imaginative, much more creative. I think Aristotle was greater than any of the philosophers and scientists of today. We didn't become more advanced, we became less advanced, but to compensate for that, we have so much more knowledge. We have so many more ways of accessing the knowledge. We have libraries, we have computers, we have a collection of so much material. So God balances things by making us simpler, but equipped with much more knowledge. An average scholar, great scholar, 100 years ago, if he had a large library, he had 1,000 books, 2,000 books. Today, we have access to tens of thousands with just a click of a mouse. So that makes us smarter? No, it just means we have access to more material. Well, I'm saying the same thing is true with monotheism. Monotheism was the original belief, much more sophisticated than anything that came later. We degenerated. And Abraham was the first person to restore the world back to its original position of belief in one God, the awareness of one God. Who is the one who perfects it? That's the Mashiach, who is the descendant of King David. King David is always identified as being the beginning of the line towards the Mashiach. He brings perfection to creation. But who is the linchpin in between Abraham and David? That's Moshe. By giving us the Torah, that's the linchpin that allows us to take the foundations that Abraham laid with the perfect world that Mashiach, i.e. David, will bring. And that's why that's the ultimate Adam. Adam, now the acronym of Abraham, David, and Mashiach, or Moses rather, that is the way to rectify the human being. And that's why Noah is looked upon in a disparaging way, because he didn't do that. He didn't correct the Adam. It was left for Abraham to start. Now, just a simple question is asked by commentaries. It says that Noah was not the same if he would have been in another generation, such as the generation of Abraham. Noah and Abraham, in fact, did overlap. Even though they were 10 generations apart, Noah lived to the ripe old age of 950. He was, I think, the third oldest person to have been recorded in the Torah. Methuselah was the first. Does anyone know the second most advanced age? Methuselah lived 969. And then Noah was 950, but the second, I think, was Yered. He lived 962, if I'm not mistaken. You can check it in Genesis, I'm not unsure. But anyhow, 950 is long enough. He bankrupted the Social Security system. No question about that. So if you make the calculations, the Torah gives you the age of every one of his descendants up until Abraham. Abraham was 58 years old when Noah died. And it's interesting, 58 in Hebrew is Noach. Noach's name that's how I remember it, because that's the mnemonic that if you remember Noach is 58, Abraham was 58 years old when Noah died. So they did overlap. So why does it say that in Abraham's generation he would have been a nobody? Because Abraham had 3 stages in his life, 3 at least, maybe more. The first stage in his life, he was an idolater. He grew up in an idolatrous home, in an idolatrous environment where everyone was doing that. Then he began to reject idolatry. There are different versions as to what age it was. Some say 3, some say 40, some say 48, some say 52. But they're not mutually exclusive views. He grew in his development. At the age of 3, he started asking questions. When did he crystallize his belief in one God? When he reached the age of his past 50. That was his second stage. And he shared it with other people as well. But the third stage in his life is when he left Haran, his home country, his father's house, and he went to the land of Israel, Canaan as it was then called. And then he began to promote monotheism in a massive way, not just quantitatively, but qualitatively. He was recognizing and giving other people the means to appreciate the belief in one God based on rational thought. He was a philosopher, and he taught people to the point where they could appreciate it, became part of their consciousness. That stage, Noah was not around anymore. Noah was only around in the early stages of Abraham, when he became a monotheist. But where it changed the world, that's only in Abraham's third stage of his life. And Noah did not live through that third stage. Now, we have two opinions. Noah is to be praised, and Noah is to be disparaged. What is this dispute about? So again, the Rebbe's father, in his commentary on the Zohar, says the following. This is a general idea that we find in many different stories of villains. What many villains have in common, from the perspective of Kabbalah, is that villains are not people who have inferior energy, inferior spiritual energy, but actually superior spiritual energy that goes awry, that is channeled the wrong way, that becomes overbearing, destructive, and harmful. And Kabbalah refers to a system that God used in creation of the world, based on the word in Genesis that the world was tohu, was desolate, vavohu, desolate and void, a world of desolation. So the Kabbalah explains that in the hierarchy of spiritual worlds, there's a transcendent world called the world of tohu, the world of chaos. The world of chaos is a world in which there are such potent spiritual and godly energies that they cannot be contained. The text of the Kabbalah is that in the world of Tohu there is powerful light, but very small vessels. The analogy would simply be you plug the appliance into a line, would it be a 220 line? What is ours, 110? And then, of course, you have an explosion because it's too much energy for the instrument. The instruments can't contain it. It short-circuits everything. Now, what's wrong with having a lot of energy? If a little energy brings light, a lot of energy should bring more light. Yes, it does, but so much that it can't be contained. In the world of Tohu, all the levels are separated from one another because they're intolerant of one another. What does that mean, intolerant? If a person is so into kindness, intolerant is not, I'm not using it as a negative word, although it could become negative. If you are just totally obsessed with kindness, you don't have a bone in your body that wants to admonish, that wants to criticize, that wants to discipline, and then you meet someone who is the opposite, you're going to have the biggest explosion in the world because you cannot possibly sit in the same room. People just have different personalities. There are very strong personalities. They may be tohu personalities, and they just can't get along. In order to get along, you have to have a little bit of the other person's personality within you. If you're an extremely kind person, you also have to have a critical side where you could see the other person's desire and penchant for more discipline and more criticism. Then you can get along. You can find a middle ground to work together. But if you're just chesed and you're just gvura, kindness versus strength or severity or judgment, many translations of that word, you're going to clash and you'll never be able to get together. So in the Kabbalah we find that many of the sins that are mentioned in the Torah are actually sins from people who had souls that were too powerful for their vessels. And therefore it created various forms of destruction. Whether it was the people of Sodom, whether it was the, later on a different level, because they're not all identical, the students of Rabbi Akiva who couldn't get along with each other, and they all died out in a very short period and became a very sad period in history, or whether it was the generation of the flood. These people had souls from the world of Tohu, and therefore they shattered. The vessels shattered, and they were destroyed. Their destruction was not necessarily to be seen as a punishment. You do this, I'll do this to you. It was self-destruction. God was just making it sound like, I am now going to punish them. They punish themselves. If you have too strong of a personality, and because of that you can't get along with others, and you destroy every bit of your relationship with everyone in the world, are you going to say, well, someone punished you? No, you punished yourself. Well, God is behind everything, so we say God punished you, but it's really self-destruction. There are some people who are self-destructive, possibly because they have too much of whatever energy may be positive, if it's modulated, if it's channeled the right way. The world of Tikkun is a world that has much less energy in it, but it has all the vessels you need. Ample vessels, very limited light. And that's the world that Abraham began to introduce. He was able to bring the energy into the world should be able to focus on and receive. Noah's generation was totally destructive. And that's why one opinion says that Noah, in his generation, if he would have been in another generation, he would have been a nobody. Because in the world of Tohu, there's only destruction. There's no way of putting things together. There's no way of changing the world. The world will just go back to its penchant to destroy itself because the energy cannot be channeled. Noah was from that generation, and therefore, if he would have been another generation, he couldn't have survived. It's interesting. In the Talmud, these two views are the views of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says that if he would have been in another generation, he would have not been anything. And Rish Lakish says that if he would have been in another generation, he would have been much better. Well, what was the difference between these two people? Rabbi Yochanan was a great rabbi, grew up in a very holy environment. Rish Lakish was a head of a band of thieves, brigands, of gangsters, highway robbers. And he was the one who, you know what, I have to correct myself. The world of Tohu is the world with powerful energy. So if Noah would have lived with his powerful energy in another generation, and he would have channeled that energy, he would have been greater than Abraham, because he had more energy than Abraham. And that's the view of Rish Lakish. Rish Lakish was a man who came from the world of Tohu. He was with such powerful energy that he used the wrong way. He was a criminal. And one day he sees Rabbi Yochanan swimming, and Rabbi Yochanan from the distance looked like a woman. So he jumped into the water to grab her. And when he sees it's a man, he was disappointed, of course, but the rabbi who saw him and saw his strength says to him, if you would divert your strength into Torah study, I will let you marry my sister, who's the most beautiful woman. And that's what happened. He became a disciple of Rabbi Yochanan, and he married his sister. And he not only became a disciple, he became a colleague of Rabbi Yochanan. He was on equal standing in his scholarship and his leadership. He became known as one of the greatest rabbis of his time. Actually, if you ask me of his generation in Israel, that's where they lived, he and Rabbi Yochanan were the two greatest. So what was the difference between them? Rabbi Yochanan came from the world of Tikkun. His energy was spiritual, but modulated, ample vessels. So he says Noah was a nobody compared to Abraham. Abraham was able to channel the energy properly. Noah was not able to. But Rish Lakish, who cherished his own spiritual power coming from the world of Tohu, He said, no, on the contrary, Noah was a much more powerful figure. Had he lived in the age of Abraham, he would have overtaken Abraham because he would have channeled his great spiritual energy into the vessels in a way that Abraham could not have done. Just interesting that the ultimate goal, what is our ultimate goal in life? In the Kabbalistic sense, the same thing can be said in many different ways, but in the teachings of Kabbalah, our ultimate goal is to access the energy of Tohu into the vessels of Tikkun. That's what the Messianic age is, where we can have our cake and eat it too. You know, sometimes you can get your cake, but you can't eat it. You can get the vessels of Tohu, but you can't benefit because it's overbearing. It's too powerful. Sometimes you can eat whatever you get, but you're getting morsels, and it's not satisfying. So you can either get a lot of cake and not eat it, or a little cake and not be satisfied. The ultimate goal is to have the ample amount of cake with all of its rich icing, and it doesn't add a single ounce to your weight. You're able to enjoy it, and it nurtures, and it's nutritional, and you're healthy. You get the best of both worlds, because in our world, what's healthy is not really, that doesn't taste that good. What tastes good is not so healthy. But that's a metaphor, that if it's very rich, tohu rich, it's not healthy for you. It's destructive. It shatters you. If it's tikkun, it's not satisfying. It's morsels. You don't get filled by that. But to have both worlds together, now how do we do that? How do we accomplish that? Noah couldn't do it. He was tohu without tikkun. Abraham started it, but was still here 3,800 years later. The answer is, every mitzvah we do involves a physical object. If not an object, it involves our physical organs. Even if it's meditation, it involves our brain, which is physical. So every mitzvah that we do that is ordained by the Torah as a mitzvah involves something physical. When the world of Tohu shattered the vessels, shards of that world containing the energy, the Kabbalah talks about it in physical terms, but of course it doesn't mean physically, fell into our physical world, into physical objects. So this podium over here, and this microphone, and the jacket, and the books, and everything physical, and our organs, our hands, our feet, all contain hidden energy from the world of Tohu. But they're locked up. They're contained in a way that you cannot benefit from them. It's as if they're in a lockbox and no one has the key. But we do have the key. Every time we do a mitzvah that involves any physical object, location, organ of the body, we unlock that light of Tohu. And since we're unlocking it one step at a time, it doesn't overwhelm us. So we're able to process it, and it doesn't cause a short circuit. And with the cumulative effect of unleashing all that energy from Tohu, the world gradually has become, the vessels have expanded to contain the overpowering, overarching energy of Tohu, to the point that when we have enough critical mass of the energy of Tohu, and the vessels are constantly expanding, we will have a perfect world, the Messianic age. Then we will no longer be threatened by the power of Tohu, and not be limited by the vessels, the limited vessels of Tikkun. There will be a marriage between the two. Noah couldn't do that. Abraham, David, and Moses were able to start that process. And that's why Noah is not given the credit. But on the other hand, Rish Lakish says we have to give credit where credit is due. He took the energy of Tohu and he was able to later on reverse it. So he felt that Noah just had that quality, that he introduced something unconventional that no one else could do. He didn't succeed in channeling it, but he succeeded in generating it. And that's something that was not done by Abraham, David, or Moses. Okay, any questions? Yes?
Is the nature of these vessels, and I'm trying to understand vessels, I'm hearing as an abstraction, but is the nature of the vessel directly related to man's identification with his personal self?
A vessel means an instrument. Everything in this world contains two parts. There's the energy and the matter. The matter conveys the energy. Same thing is true in a spiritual world, in an intellectual world. You have, let's say, you read a book. The words in the book don't have anything. They're just words, just letters. They're the vessels. But the knowledge that's contained in those words is the energy, is the light. And then you go to every level, in every world, there's the channel, there's the instrument, and then there's the energy or the light that it contains. So that's how the Kabbalah deals with every level, from the lowest physical realm to the highest spiritual. There are oros and kalim, lights and vessels. And in some places the lights are more powerful than others, and the vessels are small, insignificant. Some places the light is limited, and so on. So just take any level you want, and you'll find both elements in it. Yes?
I'm kind of interested in this whole process of simplification to chaos and chaos to simplification. And good and evil. And the process of clarifying chaos to simple or order is what we are trying to do, right?
We're trying to take not chaos into order, the chaos itself, but the power that caused the chaos into order. We don't want chaos. We want the energy that creates chaos. I mean, take, for example, in the 60s, there was a lot of chaos. But where did that chaos come from? It came from very powerful, positive energy. But if it wasn't channeled the right way, it became destructive. People started going to drugs and other antisocial types of behavior that didn't advance the world to a better place. It actually retarded the progress of the world, even though it started off with a very positive energy. So we don't want the chaos. We want order, but the order should be a reflection of a much more intense. We're not satisfied with the way things were before the 60s. You know, they were too common, too quotidian, too bland. We want excitement, but we want the excitement to be a positive type of excitement. Yes.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that I believe Rabbi Yochanan's ideas, for me, are much more probable, because if you read the book of Noah, throughout God's conversation with Noah about the flood coming, building the ark, Noah never says anything. He doesn't say a word. And why Resh Lakish would think he would be greater in Abraham's generation is beyond me, because it was Abraham who says, should the judge of all the world judge Sodom if there's 10 righteous men? I mean, he questioned God. Noah never questions God. I mean, I think there's a tremendous difference between the two personalities.
Actually, the Zohar in another place does point out that Noah is sometimes credited with the flood. He could have averted it if he had tried harder to change people's ways, and he didn't do that. So he's blamed with the flood. Abraham argues with God to save people. Moses puts his life on the line for his people. So that is the argument against Noah. Okay, but Noah's lawyer would say... Noah's lawyer would say, you can't really compare me because I had a much tougher clientele to deal with. They were not receptive to my message. And I stood against the whole world, and I remained steadfast in my faith and my morality. I didn't change, even though everyone around me was trying to get me to change. Abraham didn't have it as bad because people were not as bad at his time. And therefore you can't blame me for being the way I was. So you can judge any person both ways. And the reason why we want to look at the positive and the negative without the Zohar is because if we look at the negative, we're looking more at what we should avoid. We should avoid doing what Noah did or did not do, even though he might not be blamed for it, but we shouldn't allow ourselves to be, God says build an ark, okay, I'll build an ark. He did everything just to do what God told him, but he didn't care about the people. Well, maybe he wasn't capable of doing it, but we shouldn't follow his example. That's the reason for the negative. Now, the Rebbe once, many times he spoke about this, but once he gave this interpretation, that God tells Noah to go into the ark. The ark is a Hebrew word. Teva is the Hebrew word for ark. Teva also means words. That God tells us we should all go into the words of prayer, the words of Torah, to save ourselves from the turbulent waters that engulf us. And there are two types of people who think that they don't have to do it. There are people who are wicked, who say, it's not going to help. It won't save me. Why should I bother? I'm going to keep on living the way I live. And then there are people who are so righteous, say, I don't need it. I'm protected. I don't need this ark. So that's why the Talmud and the Zohar find two different interpretations of Noah. One that makes him very righteous, one that puts him down to say no matter who you are, the good Noah or the bad Noah, you need to go into that ark. You need to be protected by virtue of the teachings of Torah. Yes?
Is there any other character in the Torah that's subjected to this relativistic assessment? In other words, in one way, Adam is also judged very harshly in some parts of the literature, the rabbinic literature. In some places, he's praised to the high heavens. That of all the great souls that ever lived, the highest soul next to Mashiach is Adam's, higher than Moses. So is there a message then?
But yet, in other places, Adam was an egotist, and he was a heretic, and he was... they're not mutually exclusive.
No, but is there a message to the fact that the number of people so assessed is so limited?
It's hard to be both. It's possible, but it's hard to be both. Abraham is never criticized.
In this room, we never hear about relativistic statements. We never hear, well, in this setting you should be one way, but it's okay in another setting to be different. So we have an absence of relativism throughout.
No, there is. The relativism here is not by saying that this is right here, but it's wrong here. It's how we view things. If everything is relative in terms of our perceptions, only God is not relative, and His teachings are not relative, but our perceptions of them are. It's like a poor person finds a $100 bill; it's the greatest discovery. A billionaire finds a $100 bill; he doesn't even notice it. Doesn't bother. Same $100 bill, same value, objectively, but it's based on perception. It's different. Perceiving Noah in his, from one perspective, he's the greatest. From another perspective, he's nothing. He's a nobody. And they're both true perspectives. Yes.
You think about it in a way like Noah had so much hard work to do building the ark and taking care of all the animals
Right.
for all that time.
And the EPA gave him a fine because he polluted the environment. The PETA said you're not treating the animals right. Who? Abraham?
So why did you die to all the people that came back?
Well, he lived to the age of 175. He did a little bit more than whining and dining in his life. He was traveling a lot also and changing the world, preaching to people. Yes?
Given that the world seems to be, in my view, more chaotic as time goes on because people travel more and have more connections within the world than they did maybe 40 or 50 years ago, are we moving in the right direction with all the chaos that we see?
Well, I think we're moving in the right direction. The world is becoming a much more unified world. But there's always going to be, until Mashiach actually changes the world permanently, we're going to see the last rumblings of negativity in the world, of chaos in the world. I mean, never has the world been so unified as it is today. With communication the way it is today, with technology, there's no such thing as there's no difference between your neighbor and someone living in Australia. You're just as close if you choose to be. So the world is becoming a much more unified world in the realm of science. Scientists are coming much closer to recognizing the unity in the universe, as opposed to the way science used to look at the world as containing so many different disparate elements. The whole idea of what is the ideal is to see the unity in everything. And it's just one little step to seeing the divine unity in everything, where everyone sees the good in everything. And I think that's becoming much more evident. But as I mentioned in many other classes, because good and evil are becoming more separated, the mixture of good and evil is becoming less pronounced, and good is becoming much more distilled and pure, then evil is becoming more distilled and pure. That's why the evil today, in many ways, is worse than the evil in the past. In the past, the evil was mostly, the Romans killed Jews. Why do they kill Jews? Because Jews were rebelling against them. It was political. That doesn't make it nice or good or anything like that. The Holocaust and now the Islamic evil is like, we're killing you because we want to kill you. That's it. We just want to kill people, and it's not political anymore. It's become either racial or the utter perversion of religion, which is they're totally different, but they're the same in the fact that they're the most evil that you can imagine, and that's because the world is coming to the point where evil is ready to go out of business, and it's putting up this big sign, "Going out of business sale," and it's capitalizing on its last gasps for air. But the good is also stronger than ever before. You see people doing acts of kindness, random acts of kindness, people helping other people, so much more than ever before. There's so much more good in the world. There's positive cures for illnesses, and just people doing good, much more than ever before. And unity is the feature that we see much more than ever before. Yes?
For my last question, isn't with Noah, isn't it really a commentary about the community that he's in much more so than about Noah himself? I mean,
it's obvious that it's about the community, but the question is, what was Noah's role? He's one person standing up to the whole world, so does he get credit for that, or does he look like he's a nobody because it's only good in contrast to everyone else? Okay? Have a good week.